To you looking at me, make the Lord your anchor. Cling to Him because He is coming back soon. I have a testimony you need to hear, so come and listen to the good news. Before we continue with the story, do not forget to click on the notification button in order to get notified at every new video posted. May God bless you. And if you've been touched by the story, help us touch more souls by clicking on our PayPal link. Thank you. I remember that day like it was yesterday. I was a very cheerful young girl, but very modest at the same time because my parents taught me that the only way I could keep my honor was by acting respectably. So I made myself very small in all the activities that surrounded my life. And it was during a recollection I met the man who asked me to marry him. We had gone to a very famous touristic center when the monitor made an announcement to us. He said in his loudspeaker that a prince from far, far away had come to visit us. The prince was quick to make his introductions and sympathize with everyone. And then he approached me and told me that he was there precisely to meet me. I found him very charming and very amusing at the same time, so I addressed to him and introducing myself politely. He had such fine manners and was very polite that we spent the whole recollection together without leaving each other for a single minute. Once the recollection was over, I asked him if he was going to return to his kingdom, and he said no. He also made me understand that he rented a hotel for himself and his close guard just because he needed to be with me, something which I found rather odd since we had just met. And he replied to me that he loved me so much that being in my presence was enough for him. This answer convinced me, so we took the opportunity to get to know each other better. He came to see me every day and spent hours talking about everything and nothing together. I gradually began to get attached to him, and I think the feelings were mutual since he was quick to ask for my hand in marriage, something that I immediately accepted. Once the request was made, he had to meet my parents. Preparations to meet my parents were made, and the day came and he arrived in our yard with a long procession of cars where there was only his close guard. But against all odds, there was no trace of his parents. However, in our customs, the boy should come with his parents in order to meet the family of his fiancée. And when he was asked why there was no trace of his family, he simply replied that his family would be present when the union was sealed. In addition, he made us understand that he was the only son to his family and that his father was very protective and close to him, something that made my parents very curious since usually dads were quite protective of their daughters as they were vulnerable. But not to offend me, they kept the conversation going until a church wedding date was chosen. But before leaving, my fiancé asked a very relevant question to my parents, that of knowing if we were all patient by nature. My parents didn't understand what he meant, so their reaction was very ambiguous. Without explaining, my fiancé left, promising to come back a few days later to help me with the wedding preparations. While waiting for the wedding preparations to begin, my parents received a series of rather unexpected visits. Each time it was neighbors or relatives who came to see them to let them know that I had made a very bad choice of fiancé. They were either calling my fiancé's family evil or saying my fiancé was someone very cruel and mysterious. Many people said that the kingdom he came from was famous for keeping a lot of secrets, that its inhabitants had strange habits. They didn't act like normal people. Without forgetting this part where they described my fiancé's father as a man whose power came from an unknown source and that my stay in this type of home could only be dangerous for me. What reinforced their fear was the fact that my fiancé had not returned as he promised to help me with the wedding preparations. In a panic, they began asking more and more questions about his origin and especially about whether I had already gone to see his parents. I told them no, that I didn't mind because I completely trusted him and what he told me. I also said how convinced I was of his love for me and how sure I was that he would never hurt me despite his absence. Out of love, my parents believed me, and despite my fiancé's absence, accompanied me during all the preparations. A few weeks later, the wedding date arrived, Everything was ready, and despite the doubts that resided in the minds of those who were close to me, I had the faith that everything would go well. I arrived at the church with my family, dressed in my wedding gown and with a beautiful hairstyle and my makeup ready. And as expected, my fiancé arrived with his whole procession. I was over the moon. He had kept his word, but something was wrong. He still hadn't returned with his family members as he had promised. This caused a lot of gossip among the family and the guests who were present at the church. They saw it as a lack of respect, and they felt like my fiancé was lying about coming from a royal family, which is why his parents weren't there. I asked him the question while we were in the front of the altar, waiting for the priest, but he reassured me that when the time came, I was going to meet his family and that I was going to have a place of choice in his kingdom. We all took our seats and the wedding celebration ceremony began. We listened to the gospel, and just as we were about to say our vows, his phone started ringing. There was consternation in the church as the whole congregation considered it disrespectful to leave a phone on while celebrating a wedding. Against all expectations, he picked up, and on the other end of the line, it was his father who was asking him to see him immediately. Without arguing, he accepted and hung up. Then he turned to me to tell me his father needed to see him immediately and that he would be back to resume the wedding ceremony. I begged him to stay. I explained to him that it would be a big shame for me to be abandoned in front of the altar by my fiancé. I even started crying, hoping to convince him. I promise I'll be back for you. Don't be afraid and be sure I love you, he told me. But I might be ashamed in front of my whole family. Please stay with me, I told him while crying. To reassure me, he told me he will leave me with his butler to keep me company, and also to prove that he was sincere and that he will be back. Just after these words, he left the church under the confused look of all the guests who were present in the room. I could already hear the people whispering inside, and I knew very well that they were talking about what had just happened and the abandonment I had just experienced. But I had to look good, so I kept smiling. 1 hour later, he still hadn't arrived. Part of my family was already sitting outside because of the heat. I heard loud voices of exasperation, but I chose not to be swayed by whatever was going on outside, and I stayed calm. Meanwhile, my fiancé's butler held my hand, reassuring me that his boss still kept his word and would be back. During this time, my fiancé ended up joining his father, with whom he had a very long conversation about my origins and especially about the fact that it was important to test my patience and my love for him. My fiancé reassured him by telling him that he was sure he had made the right choice and that he had to leave so we could close the wedding ceremony. But his father told him to wait a little longer to test me. During this time, I was still sitting inside the church and it had already been 2 hours. This time around, my parents themselves were already seated outside, and this was not a good sign at all. They felt humiliated and began to remember the words coming from all the relatives who asked them to pay attention to my fiancé. They gave reason to these people who gave themselves the pleasure to criticize my future marriage. I was in total shame. But his butler still insisted that I remain patient and confident, for his master would never let me down. But 3 hours later, he still wasn't back. My parents had already left, and before they left, I saw on their faces that they were mad with rage. Some of my friends had already left too, and I found myself alone in front, sitting with the butler who kept reassuring me. My makeup had already smudged from tears and sweat. 20 minutes later, he still was not back. The rest of the friends I had in the church were looking at me with a mixture of pity and incomprehension. Then each of them would come out in turn, a way of sneaking out without wanting to hurt me. Even the priest had already left, and there were only 8 people left in the parish. I couldn't bear the shame, so I got up despite the butler's efforts and left. Once I arrived at my best friend's house, she consoled me and I fell asleep. When I woke up, I checked my cell phone and I saw missed calls from the butler and my fiancé. They had also left a ton of messages telling me to come back to the parish because my fiancé had returned. I got up suddenly and took a taxi to return to the parish at full speed. Once I arrived there, I found the priest who was about to close the church. He made me understand that my fiancé was back and that this time he came with all of his family and his retinue. They waited for me for hours without success. Tired of waiting, they left. I started crying, trying to call him on the phone, but didn't pick up. It was too late. I collapsed in tears. While I was regretting my actions and lamenting, I suddenly woke up. Oh, it was just a dream. The next day on my way to church, I explained this dream to my priest and spiritual guide. He explained to me that it was a premonitory dream, that my fiancé represented Christ and his church, and that his father obviously represented the Almighty, and that the butler who stayed by my side represented the Holy Spirit, who asked me each time to remain patient and trust in Jesus. That I had become impatient because of the influences of my family and other people around me who did not understand the object of my mission, and that because of my frailty, I abandoned Christ without taking account of his word and his promise. I was shocked while listening to this interpretation, and the priest was totally right. At the end of the interpretation, I swore to myself to remain firm to my faith that animated me. I promised myself to continue to pray and spread the gospel, so that when Christ returns accompanied by his Father our Almighty, that I would not be left behind because of my weakness. This is why I ask you today, my brothers and sisters, to cling to God because he is coming soon.